So welcome everyone to the last session of the Brownback seminar. So this is a work of mine with the Asian Productivity Institute. Okay, so the title is Export, Innovation and Productivity, Firm Level Evidence from Thailand. Okay, so the motivation of this paper starts with a big question, okay? So we ask about the problem of middle income trap that Thailand has faced for over a decade now. Okay, so we start moving up from the lower middle income into an upper middle income in 2011, and we have remained there since then. Okay, so the question we usually hear is, how do we escape from this middle income trap, especially with many risks surrounding economic slowdown? We got hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so we also have heard about economic model, Thailand 4.0, of how we're trying to transform our economy into a value-based digital economy with like innovation as priority. Okay, so I have this a little picture showing you the evolution of Thailand economy. Okay, so the goal is to try to move Thailand into a more innovative economy. Okay, so perhaps let us look at the innovation situation in Thailand. Okay, so how much do Thailand spend in general on research and development, or the percentage of amount that we spent for in terms of research and development to GDP so far is less than 1%. Okay, this is the expected GRD from the NXPO, or the National Education of Science. The name is quite long. So OBSH นะคะ So the president of NXPO also suggested that without any new measures to boost R&D investment in the private sector, the GRD of Thailand may remain less than 2%, which is lower than the target rate of 2%. Okay. So what about how is Thailand doing compared with countries in developing East Asia? Okay, so Thailand is around here, the blue dot here, so less than 1%. Our neighboring countries are also lower than 1%, whereas Malaysia about 1-ish, China above 2%, and compared to developed high-tech economy like the US or Japan or Korea, which is above 3% or almost 5% for Korea. Okay, so how do we boost our spending on R&D as well as innovation for Thailand? Okay, so my next thought is about how Thai economy is highly dependent on external economy, because the value of Thailand export of goods and services is amounted to over 60 to 70% of GDP, so which is very high. Okay, so I'm particularly interested in the complementarity between how we invest in our R&D and the export market participation of Thailand. Okay, so the literature about trade and innovation has suggested that trade is likely to boost innovation because of both the exports and imports through. So for example, export might provide a larger market opportunity. So firms have more incentive to innovate or invest more in R&D because the returns of successful innovation will be higher. Okay, so firms might want to innovate more if it can exploit this export opportunities from larger market size. For example, if you think about, investing and selling to only Thai customers for about 66 or 70 million people versus, selling to ASEAN economy of more than 10 times. So the return to investment will be higher if you can, participate more in the export market. Okay. So the second channel comes from the competition through imports. Okay. So if we have more trade openness, this would mean more competition because import products will compete with you. So you have more incentive to innovate in order to run away from this competitors. Okay, in order to be able to compete with cheaper import products. Okay, so there's quite a number of papers looking at the trade and innovation. Okay, so starting from Grossman and Helpman and R. Robertson Su, and more recently, paper by Redding. Okay, so in this trade and innovation, okay, different papers focus on different channels on how trade could affect innovation. Okay, there are many channels that people have looked into, and there's also static versus dynamic gains from innovation as well. Okay, because it depends on the export status of yours, whether you want to innovate or not, and the returns to successful innovation may also feed back into how you want to select yourself into the export market. Okay, so in this paper, I want to ask in general about how do firms innovate in Thailand in order to understand more about why do we still have very low spending on R&D as well as innovation. So I want to understand about the innovation and trade in the context of firms. So initially, I want to ask like a very general question. I want to understand, which firms are more likely to innovate and carry out R&D. What are the firm's characteristics that would determine, this likelihood of innovate and R&D? Okay, so I want to also look into which firms spend more, not just, whether or not they invest or not invest, but how much more do they invest in terms of R&D and innovation. Okay, so this is concerning innovation input. Okay, so when we talk about innovation, that could be innovation input because you spent in terms of R&D. Okay, and I will also want to look in terms of innovation output, the successful innovation, because when you spend on R&D, you don't know, the likelihood of this R&D will turn into successful, innovation or invention in terms of whether you can come up with new product. This is how we usually measure innovation output. Or could you come up with new service, or could you come up with like the new process in which you conduct your business in order to reduce the cost of your production? Okay, so the question I want to also ask is, do firms that invest more in R&D are more likely to report innovation? Because there might be incidents that firms that do not invest in R&D could come up with, new product service or process just through knowledge spill over from, customers or suppliers. Okay, it is not just not it is not sufficient, for you to invest in R&D in order to come up with innovations. Okay. Next one is very important. It concerns which firms have higher productivity. Do firms that invest more in R&D, and do firms that have more or record more of innovations, do they have more productivity? Okay. So that's sort of a three-step process here. So first, how much you spend in R&D, how much this R&D turn into innovation, and whether this innovation would lead you to a higher productivity firm. Okay. Also, other important questions are what determine incentive to innovate? What about policy stimulating R&D and innovation? Does this help incentivize firms to invest more or spend more on R&D? Okay. And also, what inhibits innovation? What are some of the major obstacles for firms to, not spend on R&D or to innovate? Okay, so the first part will be looking at sort of very general questions, trying to understand firms' behavior in terms of, R&D and innovation. Okay, but the main objective of this study will empirically explore the nature, direction, and timing of the link between innovation, exporting, and productivity of firms in Thailand. Okay. So again, the context will be, lies in the firm behavior. Okay. So how will I carry out this study? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about this data that I will use. It is the Thailand Research, Development, and Innovation Surveys conducted each year by the NXPO, okay, from 2011 to 2018. So we have the data up to 2018, which is the latest, but I believe they have some sort of internal process in which they changed people who conduct the survey. So we cannot get a hold of the 2019 just yet. Okay. So there's a slight problem in terms of the data collection during 2012 to 2013 because of the timing and because of the problems in data collection. So during 2012 to 2013, the data has been collapsed to only one survey. Okay. So this survey was conducted on manufacturing, service, as well as retail and wholesale trade. But for this particular study, we will only look at the manufacturing firms. Okay, so again, since it is not a this sort of a quite long timing span, there might be firms, coming in or out of the survey. So I want to limit this scope of the study by looking into firms that appear in this survey for 2 or more years of observation. So this is particularly important when it comes to productivity estimation. Okay, so we want firms that appear more than 2 years. So the data has been reduced to about almost 24,000 firm year observations. So, okay. So it is a very sort of a detailed questionnaire, specifically asking about R&D and innovation. But we also have general firm characteristics such as year of establishment, the structure of the ownership of the company, whether firms belonging to the multinational corporation, the number of employment, capital, sales, profits, and many more of the firm characteristics which we can use to control for how firm characteristics in general could affect the incentive to innovate or the innovation outcome. Okay, so in this survey, we have both the innovation output as well as innovation input. So we have the general R&D activities, whether it is in-house or is it outsourced, whether firms conduct R&D and the amount spent on R&D. Okay, we also have different type of innovation activities. Namely, we have the question asking whether firms come up with successful new product or new process that must be very different from the previously what the company usually sells. So it must be sort of a completely different or new product. Okay. Also, we have the information about whether firms come up with a new process. Okay. And also question asking about whether firms could come up with new invention or new prototype plans. Okay, and we also have external collaboration for R&D and innovation related questions, whether do firms collaborate with any research institute or any university, or also about policy questions, whether firms utilize any of the government support program, or whether firms participate in any of the financial resources provided by different organizations. So I hope to be able to utilize as much as information collected from this survey. Okay. So I will talk briefly about just general R&D and the distribution of firms. Okay. Okay. So the first one is the distribution of the data by year, and the right panel showing you the share of firms having R&D investment. Okay. So excuse me for a second. แป๊บนึงนะคะ Okay, so you can see that the proportion of firms with reporting having R&D investment. So this is just a dummy because some of the firms might report that they have the R&D investment, but they are reluctant to perhaps report the amount of R&D spent. So initially, I just focused on this R&D dummy, and I hope to extend this R&D variable to the the continuous variable R&D investment. Okay, so the proportion of firms ranging from about 25 or 26% to 50% of firms having R&D investment. Okay, so the left panel showing you the distribution of firms by size. So we have equally likely number of small, medium, and large firms, and we have a different proportion of firms reporting having R&D investment. So we are seeing pattern here. We are seeing less fraction of firms that are small conducting R&D compared to medium and large firms. Okay, so this is a sort of very clear pattern that we expected already. Okay, so the next one is whether firms belong to multinational corporations. Okay, so we have only about 14% of firms belonging to multinational corporations, and these firms are sort of reporting a little less fraction in terms of reporting R&D, positive R&D investment. Okay, so the fraction of firms that belongs to multinational corporation and do not belong to multinational corporation, so that do not show any or should show any different pattern here. So sort of a roughly the same proportion of firms, whether or not they belong to multinational corporation or not. Okay, so the next one, okay, this is the question asking about the ownership structure of firms. We have 4 categories. So the red portion, which is the majority of firms in this survey, are Thai national firms only. So only Thai shareholders. Whereas the dark blue suggests that minority of the shareholders or minority of the owners are Thai, so less than 50%. Okay, the yellow is the majority of the shareholders are Thai, and the blue is the foreign-only firms. Okay, again here we sort of see some patterns that firms with foreign direct investment, whether it be majority is Thai or majority is foreign, have a slightly higher percentage of firms that conducting R&D investment. Whereas sort of interesting here to observe that foreign-only firms have the lowest proportion of firms conducting R&D investment. Okay. So the next one would be the distribution by industry. Okay, so we have firms belonging to different industries here that I group into. First, the blue color display firms belonging to industries that is high tech. Okay, and the orange color showing you firms that belonging to industry that is low tech. So we have many firms belonging to food sector, chemicals, and electronics. So the left panel showing you the distribution of firms that belong to different industry. Okay, so here I group I seek two digits of industry into a more aggregate industry as shown here. Okay, so let us look into the share of firms with R&D by industry. So we have the highest fractions of investment coming from food, followed by chemicals, plastic, mineral, electronics. So if we look into the average of share of firms belonging to high tech versus low tech, we don't see any difference in terms of the proportion of firms that invest in R&D, which is quite different from what is observed in the literature. So we normally see a higher proportion of firms belonging to high tech that would likely to invest more in R&D versus firms that are classified according to OECD definition that belong to the low tech industry. So we are seeing pretty much, equal fraction of firms belonging to high tech versus low tech that conduct R&D. So we are seeing some interesting pattern here. Thai firms invest a lot in R&D, especially in food, because this is the sector that it is one of the top export sector of the Thai economy. Okay. So since we have seen some pattern, not observed in the last slide. So in this slide, it is, interesting to observe the R&D by export status. Okay, in this survey, we do observe equal proportion of firms that export and do not export. Okay, so the blue color display exporting firms and the orange or yellow color display non-exporters. Okay, so we are seeing very clear pattern here compared to what other criteria that we are trying to look into before. So we see if we separate firms according to the foreign market participation, we are seeing more of firms that export and conduct R&D compared to firms that do not export. So about almost a half of the firms, half of the exporting firms do conduct R&D versus less than a quarter of firms that do not export who report R&D. Okay, so there must be a complementarity between export and R&D, which is in line with the literature, okay, that we are trying to look, or it is the main objective of this study. Okay, so the last picture that I want to show you here is now moving beyond just R&D. Okay, now we are looking at the export, different export status of firms and the rate of not R&D investment, but the rate of output innovation, being whether firms report a new product, a new service in the blue column versus, or are they reporting new process innovation in the, sorry, I'm mixing it. So the blue column is the new process innovation, and the green column is the product and service innovation. Okay, so in the previous slide, we are seeing R&D input separated by being an exporter and non-exporter. Now we are trying to observe whether, for exporting firms, do we observe more innovation output as well? And the answer is yes, both for the measures of new product and service, as well as the new process. So the next step that I did was I tried to understand more about the link between exporting, R&D, or innovation, and the productivity. Okay, because the end goal of this paper is trying to understand, R&D and innovation behavior of firms, and how do we boost the firm level productivity. Okay, so this is a picture comparing how is Thailand doing compared to other countries. Okay, so before we jump into the empirical specification, I want to show you this picture, but this picture is drawn from a different data set. This is the innovation input and innovation output of firms in different countries obtained from the enterprise survey data. Okay, so we are seeing at the right-hand side of the column showing Thailand numbers, which is the lowest compared to firms in developing Asia. So we are seeing, a problematic statistic here for Thailand, in which we are trying to tackle. Okay. So since this is an initial analysis, what I did was to just, trying to follow an empirical specification by R. Robertson Chu, who trying to estimate a dynamic structural model of producer decision to invest in R&D and export by allowing both choices to endogenously affect the future parts of productivity. Okay, so due to time constraint, I will just show you this briefly about empirical specification and initial result. which I'm still playing around with it, trying to understand the relationship or the linkages between these 3 stages of the process. Okay, so first I have here is the revenue function, which is the domestic demand of firms. Okay, so this is the log of revenue, which is a function of elasticity of the domestic demand, plus it is also a function of capital and input. But the variable that I want to focus here is the omega. Okay, so this omega is the productivity of firms, which also affects domestic revenue, which is unobserved to who conduct the analysis, but it is observed to the firm. So we don't know the firm level productivity, and we're trying to estimate this productivity of firms. Okay, so this eta D is the elasticity of demand for the domestic revenue. So this term combining with this is the composite error term, which we are trying to estimate following the procedure by Olympics, which try to turn the unobserved productivity in terms of some observable variables. Okay, so if we rewrite this equation slightly, okay, by combining the demand elasticity term into the intercept gamma 0, so by combining this term into gamma 0, and then also this time varying aggregate demand shock and market level factor into a set of dummy, okay, we can estimate this domestic revenue function as a function of the lower equation here. Okay, so this H function will be estimated using a ordinary least square, which I will show you what it refers to in the next slide. So this H function is the fitted function of this upper term here, okay, which is a function of productivity. Okay. And this productivity term is estimated to be a function of the Markov process, which depends on last productivity value, as well as whether or not firm invest in R&D last period, which will also affect productivity in this period, and as well as whether or not firms export in the last period. This will also affect productivity in the current period. Okay, so we are writing this as a qubit function, and also the inclusion of this DIT minus 1, as I said, recognize that firm may affect the evolution of its productivity by choosing to invest in R&D or not. Okay, and this EIT minus 1 term also capture the possibility of learning by exporting. Okay, and the last alpha 6 term here is the complementarity between choosing to invest in R&D as well as exporting, whether it is affecting the current level of productivity. Okay. So we're trying to rewrite this unobserved term into what we can observe. And then after plugging in this omega term into estimated H function that I showed you previously, okay, so this function can be estimated using a non-linear least square, and this underlying parameter of alpha and beta k can be used to construct a productivity estimate. Okay. Okay, so I want to show you the last equation, which is the total variable cost equation, which is used to estimate the elasticity of demand domestically and export revenue. Okay, so this total variable cost is a sum of output and marginal cost in each market. So by using the first order condition for profit maximization, this marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue in each market, and the total variable cost is an elasticity weighted combination of total revenue. Okay, so I did an initial regression here that I want to show you briefly, but there is still some correction that I need to make. But given this equation that I have shown you before, okay, and this cost equation, okay, I can estimate demand, cost, and productivity evolution. Okay, so this elasticity of demand for domestic revenue and export can be used to recover the markup over marginal cost of firms. Okay, so this can be converted into a markup of price over marginal cost. Okay, and we also obtain the estimate of beta K, alpha 0, alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha 3. But what I want to stress here is the alpha 4, alpha 5, and alpha 6, which from the previous slides, okay, this alpha 4, alpha 5, alpha 6 capture how past investment decision in R&D, past export status, which capture learning by exporting, and complementarity between export and R&D decision would affect productivity, which we're trying to estimate. Okay, so the initial result alpha 4, alpha 5, alpha 6 suggests that yes, indeed, past R&D activity do affect productivity of the firm. So if firm conduct R&D, this will affect future productivity of firms. Also, if the firms export, okay, this suggests that there will be higher productivity of firms from learning by exporting. However, this negative term might reflect that the added benefit of conducting additional activity, which is different from the current one, might not provide any further gains in terms of productivity. Okay, so this is, just a preliminary result because I just got a hold of the data, just trying to look into, the behavior of firms as well as the productivity estimation, which is unobservable. Okay, so in the next step, okay, I wish to look into more of the dynamic estimates of, how the decision to invest, export, feedback into productivity, how this affects the future returns and incentive to invest. Okay, I want to also extend the coverage of both R&D and innovation to include more of the coverage, because we always want to talk about, how efficiency is our R&D investment. Are they turning to invention? Are we taking this invention into real use? So it is important to also look about diffusion and adoption. Okay. Also, I want to look into policy related questions. Okay. Have firms, benefit from different policy simulations that the government have conducted in the past over the timeframes that we have in our records. So this will be the next steps for this study. Thank you very much. So I spent quite a little bit more time than I expected.
That's okay. We all enjoy your talk. Thank you, Ajahn Doungdao, very much for concluding our our brown bag workshop for this semester. We learned a lot from you. ขอบคุณครับอาจารย์ดวงดาว
ขอบคุณค่ะ
ขอบคุณครับ
ขอบคุณทุก
Thank you
ท่าน
อาจา
ค่ะ
รย์
ขอบคุณค่ะ
All right, thank you everyone. If you would like to share your work in the brown bag next semester, feel free to let me know. We have posted the new schedule on our webpage. Feel free to check out the dates. Thank you everyone.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you อาจารย์